profound shame that takes so many different psychological and physiological kinds of forms. So the theme obviously is about shame, and I'm going to focus the discussion that I lead today in terms of this theme of shame. But there's some groundwork that I want to put down before we get there. And so if the viewers will look at the on your left hand side where you see the developmental trauma branch there, actually there's a little piece that's missing at the bottom. It says core energy or life force at the very bottom. It may be a little hard to get on the screen. Nikki, if you can make it a little bit kind of scroll it down a little bit. But if you can't, right there, it's just a little lower.
Down at the bottom. There you go.
Okay, and I see that somebody there is saying that they can see it. I couldn't see it on my screen. Maybe because, I've got that black bar below. That's why it might not be visible on mine. So,
I can see it on mine.
Okay, good. So you see that there's this core energy or life force. It's our birthright. It's part of, and it's called, of course, many different things in different traditions, and I'm not identifying it as part of any specific tradition, but in some traditions it's called chi or ki or prana, or Reich called it orgone, and other, and even though they might have been looking at slightly different aspects of this, but I think we all have a sense of there's some kind of life force that animates us, and what we see then is that there's if you look at this chart on the left side on the kind of an angle, it says up until the first dots, it says the healthy differentiation of the life force. Now, if I move my cursor, I don't know if people can see that or not. Yeah, but if your cursor, I can see. So, it's down below. It's below the first dots, on the bottom. There we go. So we see that under the healthy differentiation of the life force, that's this life force is what gives people the capacity to express their needs. It's the capacity, when it's integrated, it feels like strength. It's the capacity for healthy aggression. And I specifically say healthy aggression because that word is, in many people's mind, come to be associated with anger. And aggression in the original sense that, like Konrad Lorenz used for, it didn't have that meaning at all. It's really another way of saying the life force. So these are our birthright. And ultimately, in the therapeutic process, we'll see it also fuels the separation individuation piece, which I'll talk about later. But when there's developmental trauma, and this can take all kinds of forms, it can take any combination of things. So you can have neglect, you can have abuse, you can have chronic misattunement, you can have just fate, where you have early death or loss of a primary caregiver, or there's so many different scenarios that can contribute to developmental trauma. And there's this normal psychobiological process that happens for every child under optimal circumstances, which is that when he or she, or when they have unmet needs, there's a bit of distress that they start to experience. They're cold, they're hungry, they're sick, whatever it might be. Even before words, they can communicate their protest, their message. Really, at first it's a message, and then if the message isn't responded to, it turns into protest. And they can communicate it even without words, through different kinds of cries. And many parents can recognize that this is a cry from that infant that means that they're cold. This means that they're sick. So, attuned parents often have that capacity. So. And normally, again, in optimal circumstances, protest is normal, and children don't have to learn, infants don't have to learn how to protest. It's inbuilt, and anybody who's raised a child knows that. So if the basic need is met, then there's no more protest, and things go back to baseline, and there's regulation, and no particular trauma. But when there are chronically unmet needs, or even worse, when there's profound neglect or physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in the family, then it creates an incredible problem, obviously, in many different levels. And I'm going to explain some of that and how this leads to shame. So what happens, though, is that first this protest is not responded to. Then it ramps up, sympathetically dominant. You can see that on the left side. The sympathetically dominant reaction is anger and rage. And this is, this again is hardwired in us to, it's just amping up the protest. But there's a danger for children from two different directions. And this is very important to understand, is that in some families, the danger is external. So that a child, when they get angry, the parents get angrier back. And obviously, in the face of parental anger, a child is helpless and frightened and terrified. Now, that's more commonly understood, but there's a less commonly understood threat, which is that even if there isn't a threat of retaliation from the part of the parents, the anger and the rage towards the person you also love and are 100% dependent upon is extremely threatening to the infant. At that stage of development, they're not able to hold a whole person in their mind. They're not able to hold that this parent, this mother or father in any given situation, who can be very loving and giving in some sense, in some circumstances, can be abusive, neglectful, or as cold as a stone wall to them in other circumstances. And so in order to protect the image and the sense of attachment and love, the child splits. They split the image of the parent into the good parent and the bad parent, and they split the image of themselves into the good self and the bad self. Now, there are many different possible permutations of how this works, but I'm going to focus on the most common one, which is that in order to protect the attachment relationship, the child tends to identify with the bad self. So, it's two things. It's one is to protect the attachment relationship, and it's also because a child's mind can't experience it any other way, in the sense that we all know that children tend to blame themselves for everything. So if parents are getting divorced, we have to explain to children over and over again, and it doesn't necessarily even go in, that it's not their fault, because their tendency is to see things that way. Because a child cannot experience herself as a good person, a small child anyway, cannot experience herself as a good person in a bad situation. So we've got all of these elements that make it really impossible for the child to even entertain or experience the anger that they feel towards the parent. Instead, in a variety of ways, they split the image, as I was mentioning a moment ago, identify with the bad self, and that's the beginning of shame, self-hatred, self-rejection, self-judgment, all of the kinds of toxic dynamics that we're also familiar with in our own work. We've all, I'm sure, all experienced elements of that, and we certainly see it with our clients. And it's really important to understand that that's why you can't talk people out of their shame. You can't convince a person that they're a good person when they're convinced that they're not. We see that it doesn't work on a cognitive level. That's why we have embodied trauma conferences, because it's got to be a kind of embodied knowing, and it's what we call, we do talk about child consciousness, and then the alternative to that is what we call normally embodied adult consciousness, because there can be a certain kind of adult consciousness that people have that's not really embodied. It's a kind of objectivity, but it's not connected. But here's the point then. With this splitting and then the projection, the child protects the attachment relationship, which they have no other choice but to do, but then their self-image, their sense of self, it dysregulates them and distorts their experience on every level. So their identifications get distorted. They feel that there's something defective or wrong or bad or shameful about them. They, emotionally, there's all of this anger and grief that gets unrecognized and unresolved. And of course, this has a profound systemic impact and dysregulating on a nervous system and really all the systems of the body. We tend to focus on the nervous system, but really it's dysregulating to every system of the body. So we save our lives by becoming by identifying at least in part with that bad self. We protect the attachment relationship, but unless we then later do our work, or in some other ways are very fortunate to be able to identify these dynamics, we're stuck and we carry these ideas forward, and these identifications and the emotional dysregulation and the somatic dysregulation that goes with this whole process. And so it's really important then to see that shame, and this is something I teach clinicians. It's something that I talk about a lot with when I was in private practice for so many years, is that most of the shame that we experience has nothing to do with us. And I say that slowly, and I say that so that I can, people can reflect on that, because for many people that's a new idea. We tend to take our shame very seriously. Obviously, it's natural that we do that as human beings. But to begin to just plant the seed that this shame that we have taken so seriously for so many years of our lives, and our clients as well, has really nothing to do with us. It's in one way we can look at it, it's often a dynamic that's just handed down from generation to generation. So that parents tend to shame their children directly or indirectly in ways that they were shamed. And then if we don't do our own personal work as parents, even when we have some knowledge and some awareness of it, we can pass that on to our children in sometimes subtler ways, but it can be a very persistent dynamic. And so I see that there are questions coming in. I'm happy to, if there's a question pertinent to what I'm just talking about right now, to take a question. If
let's see. I think there's a lot of comments. I actually do have a question, because I think what's so interesting about your work and about NARM is that it really looks at this feedback loop that gets set up, where the physiological state is, producing identifications, perception, beliefs, which then reinforce the physiological state, and so there's this sort of feedback loop happening, and that NARM really looks at incorporating both the top down and the bottom up. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that in shame. So there's this physiological component. How is that? What are the identifications it's producing in the mind?
Well, again, just a small but seemingly small but very important point is that in NARM, identifications are seen as psychobiological dynamics. They're not just, they include the mental, but there is no identification that is not also at the same time held in the body in the form of tension and or collapse. Mm-hmm. So it's important, because most people tend to think of identifications as mental processes, and in NARM we make a very clear distinction. But you're right, and what you were talking about is what I describe in the Healing Developmental Trauma book as the distress cycle. Now there is another, there's different kinds of causations for shame, and they're not mutually exclusive. So for example, when there's extremely early trauma, prenatal trauma, birth trauma, very early attachment loss, for example, there isn't much of a psychology. There's not a sense of self yet. There's not a psychology intact that we can talk about. So the earliest kinds of trauma are physiological traumas, in utero birth, early attachment. They're experiences, high arousal states and collapse and freeze states. And shame in itself is a parasympathetically dominant collapse state, which this, as we level up, this chart is up there towards the top of the chart there. But one of the things that we see happening, and it relates to this distress cycle that you were mentioning, is that if you have the earliest kind of trauma, and this includes intergenerational trauma, which is, a very big thing everywhere, but, in some countries and in some places, depending on if their parents went through war and famine or various kinds of things, it's obviously more impactful. But whatever the source is that we get this profound early physiological dysregulation. And then on top of that dysregulation, and what I call on the shaky physiological foundation of trauma, then the psychological self is built. And that sense of self then is by definition distorted, because children automatically go, if I feel bad, which they do because they've experienced, and this can be anything from early surgeries to loss of to maternal depression or death in a family or various kinds of things, is that I feel bad, therefore this isn't cognitive, they don't work it out that way, but the sense is that I am bad because I feel bad. And so the very earliest identifications then are already profoundly distorted because they're being built on this shaky physiological foundation of trauma. And then on that we elaborate, and this is what I call the connection survival style in the NARM work, the earliest stage of trauma. And then because these individuals are already dysregulated and then their sense of self is already distorted from the very beginning, they tend to have already been managing by going into a sympathetic freeze response. A parasympathetic freeze response, and they're then and the major kind of dynamic that we talk about in NARM, which is really such a simplification of traditional psychotherapeutic understanding, is that all of the so-called defense mechanisms, and we use adaptive survival style mechanisms in NARM, but all of the traditionally called defense mechanisms are all functions of disconnection. So whether we're projecting or projective identification or denial, they're all parts of disconnection. And actually, it may be interesting to some of the viewers is that the original title of the Healing Developmental Trauma book was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. When we respond to developmental trauma by disconnecting, we never, as human beings, we're hardwired for a connection. We disconnect from our body, we disconnect from our emotions, and we disconnect from other people. And it's not so, and then, that becomes a driving force, and it's really held together by toxic shame, which people can see at the very top of the chart there under the parasympathetically dominant symptoms. One of them is toxic shame, chronic fear, and so on. So
may I ask you a question,
sure,
Larry? Because you just said the word toxic shame, which was very interesting, because I know there is this distinction between healthy and toxic shame, and it feels like your work is very important in the sense that I feel like when a child feels bad, and then they have that sense that they are bad, there are behaviors that they can act in or act out, right? That can sometimes inadvertently, the environment around them then helps to reinforce the disconnection they're already feeling.
We see that all the time. And it's kind of in the direction that I was going. So it's like, if you're already afraid of other people and see other people as a threat, then you feel socially awkward, and then you feel ashamed about feeling socially awkward, and then you're more likely to have physiological symptoms, and then you feel ashamed of those. So this shame dynamic can build on itself in so many ways, in so many painful ways for us as human beings. And we can carry these dynamics to our grave if we don't find a way to work on them. And so did I answer your question, Corinne? Did that address it?
Yeah, no, I was just interested because you mentioned toxic shame as
Right.
opposed to a healthy shame, which is maybe the temporary state that you come out of again, and the toxic shaming being this very chronic and also seemingly self-reinforcing process.
Well, we know that if people don't have any capacity for shame or guilt, we tend to see those people as sociopaths. So there is such a thing as a healthy shame. As long as it's in moderation, it means that we can have empathy for another person and that we can be remorseful if we actually do harm somebody. So that's why I make that important distinction that you're bringing, you brought up, which is the difference. We're talking here about toxic shame. Actually, too, just to mention, I've got a book coming out on shame and guilt in the next 6 months. So,
What is that called?
well, interestingly, we wrote it in German, and the German title is Befreiung von Scham und Schuld, or freeing yourself from shame and guilt. So then we're going to translate it into English, and so it's actually at Küssel Verlag right now being edited, and and for those of you who are not in Germany, that's the division of Random House in Germany. It's a big company, and then we're going to take the German and all translate it into English, and then it'll be published in English. And, right now, the Healing Developmental Trauma book's, I think, out in like 14 or 15 languages. So wherever people are watching, there's a good chance that at least the first book, and in the next year or two, the second book will be in your language.
Wonderful. Someone's asked, I don't know, what do you want to carry on for a bit, or do you want to take any questions, Larry?
I'm fine. No, I find I like to mix it up, because if you talk too long, I think you start to lose people. So I like the interaction and the exchange.
Great. Well, there are a lot of questions in here, but maybe I'll just start with the first one I see. But someone's asking, how do you begin to work with toxic shame?
Well, first, you don't try and convince people. You can't work with it cognitively. It really, shame is for the most part impervious to logic and reason, because it goes much deeper. And this piece that I'm bringing in is so important, that you see that shame has an adaptive element to it. Through a child's eyes, it's life protective. So it helps us understand why maybe we've struggled with shame, or why our clients struggle with shame, and why it's been so difficult. It doesn't respond to just, cognitive or even sometimes emotional interventions. There needs to be something more. There needs to be a certain understanding. And so that it's essential that we see that shame, as painful as it is, at one point protected us. Just like all of the so-called defense mechanisms that we use. Now, of course, when these dynamics continue long after they're useful or adaptive, then they create, more suffering for us. But it's important for us as clinicians, and even for doing our own work, to keep in mind that on some level, shame feels protective to us. And it's always in service of protecting someone else, usually a parental figure. And that means then ultimately it's usually in service of protecting the attachment relationship, which is, I probably don't need to remind most of the viewers, but the attachment relationship for an infant and a small child is as essential as food, water, air. I mean, we really have to, human infants are born 100% dependent on the environment. So then going back to the theme of shame is that when we experience environmental failure and that can take so many different forms, from things of fate like, sudden death of a parent, or early surgeries, or when we grow up in toxic families, abusive families, well, we're shamed constantly. And none of these are mutually exclusive. We can have a difficult birth, and then we can have a shaming family, and we can have, a loss of a sibling. There could be all these different dynamics, but the shame is an internalization of the environmental loss. It's the way we make sense of the environmental failure that we've experienced. It's, in other words, to put it in very simple language, a child cannot, think to him or herself, well, I know that I'm a lovable person. I don't feel loved by my parents. So I'm wondering what is wrong with their capacity to love. That obviously, I use that in a provocative way because it's silly, of course, when we think of it. But it does capture what happens to people. And so if it can't be the parent, then in the child's mind, it must be then that they're unlovable in a variety of ways. And then human beings come up with so many different explanations for their sense of unlovableness. They're defective, they don't look right, they're not smart enough, they're not tall enough, they're too heavy, they're too thin. I mean, the list can be endless of things that we find fault about with ourselves. But if we keep in mind, both as clinicians and doing our own work, is that shame was ultimately protected. It's obviously a distortion, and we don't want to stay stuck in it. But unless we appreciate how essential it felt to us as small children, it makes it very difficult to free ourselves from it. So.
It's so fascinating. No, it's great. I'm curious, as an adult, maybe who experienced some developmental trauma in relationship in the early environment, who developed shame, as you're beginning to then go through the process of healing, in my experience, it seems like there are two big experiences, or if shame is kind of this shutdown state, often what's beyond that is the protest, right? Beneath that is the protest, the original anger. And it's so interesting because I feel like it creates a conflict for people when they get to that point, because they're confronting, right, that original reason why they had to internalize it, because they couldn't act it out, they couldn't have it directed towards the attachment person, the attachment of the parent in the attachment relationship. How do you begin to work with the emergence of that healthy aggression, that protest?
Well, that's exactly where I was going, and that leads us into our first little exercise. And again, people can, in terms of structuring our time, is 5 minutes okay, and for us to take just a little time? People can reflect on it, write a journal on it if they want. They can talk with a friend, or if they want a colleague or whatever. But here's a reflection that I'm going to invite people to do, and that's just to look at what is your relationship with anger. And for some people, anger is what we call in NARM a default emotion, so they go to it very easily, and that no matter what they're feeling, then they may be feeling sad or vulnerable, but they get angry. And for other people, it can be sadness, depression, anxiety. These are kind of default reactions to because anger is so frightening to them. So I'm just going to invite you all, the people who are viewing, to just reflect or talk with somebody. If you're watching this with someone, just what is your relationship to anger? Is it something that you go to easily? Is it something that's hard? Is it scary to you? Just a little bit of an inquiry into your relationship to that.
Larry, do you want to send them into breakout rooms, or do you want to just have them do it on their own in this main room?
Since I've not done this, I don't know how complex it is to do that. Is that easily manageable?
Yeah, I would say so. Mickey, what do you think?
Very easy. I can have them in the breakout.
Okay. Yeah, it's always good in a social engagement context to do it when it's possible. So let's do it.
Yeah. So anyone who wants to join the breakout rooms, you can click on the button that says join breakout room. When you see it pop up in your screen, you'll have about 5, maybe 7 minutes or so to just exchange a little bit about your relationship with anger, and then we'll head back in here. Sound good?
That's good.
Okay, and then you can stay here, Larry. You don't, of course, have to join unless you'd like to join. You can, of course.
No.
And there are always people who might just stay in the room, which is fine too. I'm seeing a lot of comments about like, I don't get angry. I mean, I think the anger topic alone is probably, and we could go very, very deep there, couldn't we?
Well, and I plan to at least to go with the time that we have available. I plan to go deeper into it, but I wanted to give them an experiential sense before we. That was enlightening for those of you who did the exercise, and it's important to understand that in NARM, even though we recognize the importance of integrating. And I'm going to say specifically what that means in a moment. Integrating anger, we never, ever try and get people into their anger. And that's an important distinction from some other somatic psychotherapies that have been oriented towards, recognizing rightly that we all carry around a lot of anger. A lot of it is unconscious to us. Some of it's more conscious, but we don't work in a goal-oriented way in NARM. And for us, and from what I teach, is that there's more important information in our fear about the anger than in the anger itself. Because when we start tracking the fear of the anger, we see that it always leads back to this basic splitting dynamic that I was describing earlier. And that means that it's the fear is that if I feel my anger, I'm going to be unloved, or I'm going to be unlovable. I'll be rejected. I'll be alone. Nobody will like me. I'll be banished. All of these, really, and this is through a child's eyes that we're still seeing that. Now, of course, there are other issues that come in that people can be afraid of, that they start touching into their anger, that they'll be destructive. We have to deal with whatever fears get in the way. But my point is that we know that the anger is important, and I'll say more why in a moment, but we never make it our goal. We never try and get into it. At the same time, though, we reflect to people when they're starting to run away from their anger. So it's an interesting balance that we hold, which is that acknowledging that it's there, but not trying to get them to feel it. And here's what's really important. There's several steps that are important, and this is ultimately connected to the theme of shame, and I'll make that connection in a minute. But in terms of working with the anger piece, there's several elements. One is that we first have to psychologically own it, and meaning we have to see that it's really us that's angry. Oftentimes we think that it's, sometimes we just feel it as anxiety. One of the common questions that I ask for people who come in complaining about chronic anxiety, I have them do this little inquiry with themselves, which is, I ask them people who are really anxious all the time, I say, what is your relationship to anger? This question is surprising to them. And generally, with very anxious people, I get almost 99% of the time this answer: anger? What anger? I mean, I know I get scared when other people get angry. I don't like to be around anger, and of course, sometimes I feel like I hate myself, but I don't get anger. So we see that it's a very frightening kind of topic, and we don't ever want to disrespect that fear. We want to understand it. We want to work with it. So the first step is psychologically owning the anger, to realize that what you thought was anxiety or some other dynamic is really about anger. And these are kind of simultaneously, it's really important because as we touch into anger, we start to feel the very powerful energetics that are involved in the anger response, the anger protest response. And we help people learn how neither to act the anger in against themselves in the form of self-judgment, self-hatred, self-criticism, et cetera, nor to act it out against other people, in the various ways that children and adults act out anger against others. Neither of those is a solution. We want to stay mindfully present to the anger, and particularly to be able to be present to and contain the powerful energies of the anger in the body. That process itself, and one other element that I'll bring up in a moment, leads to reconnection to the life force. And, just like you were saying you were doing SE, just like when people have had dealt with particularly the fight response, doing some kind of shock trauma, renegotiation, how alive and strong and powerful you feel when you've had when you could feel it. Again, in SE, just like in NARM, we don't act the anger out, we don't beat pillows or that kind of thing. It's really being present to the powerful energies. And with anger, there's one other very, very important piece, which is we want to know, it's important to remember that emotions are not casual dynamics. They're not random. They're messages both to ourselves and to the environment. And so we want to know, we want to be psychologically own it, we want to energetically be able to be present to it, and we want to understand what is the implicit message of the anger. What is the anger trying to communicate to the environment? It may have been, what was the anger trying to communicate to the environment when you were a child, or it could be more current, but we want to know what is the implicit communication. And here's really a key piece, Corinne, and everybody, is that something very important happens, that when people start integrating and owning the anger, then and knowing what the communication is, it starts to shift the relationship with the self, because implicit, inherent in protest is the communication, I don't deserve this. And you see, that's the antidote to the child's perspective that he, she, they take on, feeling whatever is going wrong in their environment, they deserve it. They're the cause. It's their fault. They're wrong. And so it changes not only the relationship with the environment, but the relationship with the self. And it's not cathartic. It's not regressive. It's again, it's more mindfully, and I talk about somatic mindfulness, like being present to this energy, but at the same time, it's not just bottom up. It's also understanding what was it that we were trying to communicate. So once, when that starts to integrate, people's lives really change. Depression lifts, anxiety diminishes, self-judgment, performance pressure, performance anxiety, which is very big in the German-speaking countries, but along with every place else, but particularly I've noticed in German-speaking countries. So all of these symptoms tend to diminish. And so it really can be life-changing for people when they are able to begin to integrate the anger. And then you see, once we start doing that kind of work on anger, the shame starts to dissolve. These elements that we've taken so seriously, that we felt so badly about ourselves, because again, I don't want to touch on this topic without just acknowledging how painful shame is when we're stuck in it. It's a very painful and dark and tight and old identification. And again, by identification, I mean both a psychological and physiological identification. And so it's, and as soon as the energy starts to move in a different direction, as soon as we're no longer feeling the need to collapse, which is what shame is, it's a kind of a collapse dynamic, that when we're not in that place anymore, the world looks different, and we feel different to ourselves. We don't feel so badly about ourselves. We're able to accept, that we can make mistakes, and that doesn't make us bad people, or that we're not perfect in appearance, and that doesn't make us ugly. We can have limitations, but we start to accept ourselves and other people more as a whole person, and not just with the very kind of limited perspective that we have when we're looking through the lens of shame.
Larry, do you feel like there's an important relationship that grief and sadness have with anger when it emerges? I mean, there's a vitality and a life force that's regained, but I feel like grief is an important part of that.
I do, but here's why I wait. Like in the training, I don't talk about grief until like usually the fourth module, because so many people, it's so common in our cultures that people default to grief because anger is too scary. But once anger has really been integrated, and then the grieving is not a default, a depressive reaction, then grieving is an important part, and it's like the part that we need to do to finish this process, because first we need to be angry at, and in the sense that to feel the anger of how we were let down in a variety of ways, or how we were abused, or how we were neglected, or, the various kinds of experiences that human beings have. And then when that's integrated, particularly when it was, anger about, let's say we had abusive parents, that when we've dealt with the anger about that, then we can start to grieve about the fact that it's never a child's first choice to be angry at the parents. As an adult, we have to integrate that to be whole again. But then the deeper wound comes out, but not then in a defensive way, in a default way. It's like, well, all we really wanted was just to be loved for ourselves. I mean, human beings we're all really fairly simple on one level, despite the seeming complexity. And so when this splitting and this shame dynamic, this is all just part of what we in NARM call the core dilemma. It's like we have to shut off what was most real and alive and authentic in us in order to maintain some kind of attachment relationship. And as adults, we have options that, of course, we did not have as children.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Larry. I would love to be able to turn it over to people. Unless you have something else you'd like to speak to first, I'd love to be able to turn it over to people to ask you some questions.
I think that's great. That's great.
Great. So I see someone has their hand raised. Giselle, would you?
Her?
Hello.
Hi, Giselle.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for this great conversation. I've signed up to do the NARM training in May, so I am just like getting a preview. Yeah, I'm very interested in what you said, that to understand a bit more what you said at the beginning, that when there is trauma in the womb, then the psychological structure is built on top of this. With this question, I also have another one which relates to my own trauma. Also, I had a rebirthing process, and on coming out, I experienced an incredible amount of rage, anger. I was kind of in the room and kicking all the chairs in the room, and I was really, it doesn't fit in my mind how a baby can have so much anger. So both questions are in one, if you could speak to this.
Well, in your mind, it doesn't fit that an infant can have so much anger, but they do. No, when you think about it, because it's a life protective mechanism, because this level of anger means that there was some basic threat to our existence, and of course we'll fight. We're hardwired to fight like crazy to survive, and so when our very survival is threatened in whatever way, then there's an incredible well of anger that comes up. And some people, you can see how little infants will turn bright red when the anger has built up. So now the other thing, though, is what you were talking about rebirthing, is that kind of work can be re-traumatizing from my perspective because of the deep breathing, if it's the kind of rebirthing that I'm thinking of, the kind of the deep breathing process, and so it's regressive, and then you open things up very quickly, and then this ton of rage comes up, and it's like then you were wanting to kick the chairs, but what I always say to people is, I don't think it was really the chairs you were angry at. So that's the difference in NARM. We want to know, where is this anger really focused? It's not enough to, like in the old days, or in some people still do, hit and kick mats and use the batakas and all those kinds of things. That tends not to integrate the anger. That's regressive, cathartic, and for people with early trauma, it can actually be fragmented. So other people who are more integrated can do okay with it, but I still don't recommend techniques where they regress and you relive stuff. So going then to the first part of your question comment was that, yeah, of course, if there's early, profound intergenerational trauma or other various kinds of traumas that people can experience in utero, it's profoundly dysregulated. And it's this dysregulated physiology then that becomes the shaky foundation upon which the psychological self is built. That's to go back to the first part of your question. Okay.
Great. I'm going to
Thank you, Giselle.
wait.
If somebody's talking, I'm not hearing anything.
Hi, I just
Okay.
got unmuted. My
Okay.
question, so I put it into the chat, but I figured that it probably got lost amongst all of the other comments. My question was kind of based on for like a child or somebody who has grown up and they've experienced anger, parents like lashing out, and so they have more of a traumatic attachment, or I guess more trauma attributed to anger. How do you begin to kind of even bring up the thought of letting somebody express that anger and feel that anger when anger is so attributed to this trauma?
I don't. A NARM kind of question would be, there's usually ways that anger or its various more subtle forms of expressing it will start to surface in the room. And if a person, can recognize that they're angry and they're afraid of it, we don't try to get them into the anger. We more explore what's the most frightening thing for you. And so, again, by going with what would be traditionally called the resistance, from a NARM perspective, that's really where the important, where the important information is. Because once those childhood dynamics are sorted through, both on a cognitive, emotional, and sensate level, then as an adult, we can experience the anger and be present to the energetics of the anger. And as you say, though, too, there are other elements that every person is a little bit different. So for some
Tracy, can
people,
you help me,
if their
Pumpkin?
parents were both like rageaholic types, then the child will also, in addition to everything else that I've described, will also say, when I grow up, I'm not going to be like them. They were
Need
both
all your
angry.
dirty clothes. Can you
I'm
please
never
get
gonna
those
be
for me?
angry, because then if I'm angry, then I'm just like my abusive father or my abusive mother or whatever it was. And so they make this kind of usually unconscious decision, sometimes conscious though, that they will never touch it, because then to be angry or to feel anger is to be just like the abuser. So in the therapeutic process, we have to be open to whatever it is that's getting in the way of the emotional completion process. And that's what we talk about in NARM, is that this is an emotional completion process. And that doesn't mean anything like regression or catharsis. I want to keep repeating that, because I know for some people they have that association that emotional completion means getting it out. And that's not what we do. But we are open to, to addressing deep and powerful emotions, but in a contained kind of way.
Thank you so much, Larry. There was actually a question about that, or someone mentioned catharsis. I'm wondering if you could speak briefly to why not catharsis?
Well, one of the things is that generally in my experience, and I've been around. I've been doing this since the '70s, so I've been around, so many different modalities. And certainly, in the '70s, there were a lot of cathartic modalities out there, and I tried a number of them. And for highly integrated people, sometimes it wasn't harmful. I didn't feel harmed by it, but I saw particularly people who are really struggling with some of the most early trauma, that it was actually disorganizing to them and regressing, and they're already struggling with being, they're already stuck in a regression. So it can reinforce the child consciousness rather than slowly lead to the embodied adult consciousness that we're holding as a possibility of that's a positive outcome of the NARM work, is that embodied adult consciousness. And this cathartic work tends to be the opposite, regressive. It actually reinforces old identifications, that I'm a helpless child, which I once was, but I'm no longer, when we're working with adults. So for that and other reasons, I certainly don't believe in regression or catharsis in the NARM work.
Thank you for that answer. Mickey, do we have someone else who would like to ask a question? Do you have time? A couple more, maybe one more question or two, Larry?
I'm fine.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe a couple more questions.
Yeah, we've got 2 hands raised. I'm going to unmute Jane.
Okay.
Hi. My
Hi, Jane.
question. Hi. My question. I read your material and I was completely poleaxed on the connection rupture and the spiritual subtype, and I felt it was really quite relevant because to this kind of talk, and also it's so early. If you could speak to how you kind of get out of that, if you've got some kind of functional self and deep spiritual connection that you can rely upon, but the actual split happens so early that you've got no knowledge of who you are apart from that split, and it's not safe, and you don't know anything. But what you can sort of rely on is a spiritual connection, and I think I identify with that, and a lot of other people in these kind of arenas do as well.
Okay, I'm happy to try and answer that. The sound was a little bit muted, so let me repeat a little bit about what Jane said. It was about the connection survival style, which in NARM is the earliest survival style, and particularly the spiritualizing subtype. And that I believe you said you related to that, or you said you were poleaxed. So it struck you in a strong way. So here's what happens in what I've seen when there's early trauma, before a person has had any opportunity for embodiment. So this means generally severe trauma of whatever kind before 6 months of age, is that literally many connection survival styles, and almost by definition the connection survival style, has not embodied, or at least fully embodied. So they never really arrived on the planet. Now and I divide the connection survival style into 2 subtypes. One is the thinking subtype, and the other is the spiritualizing subtype. The thinking subtype, we all know, they tend to be like the engineering types or the IT types. The feeling is, as long as I live in my head, I can manage the world and everything's going to be okay. I can think it through, I can think it out, and then of course they can create psychotherapies based on that belief. But they live disconnected from their body, disconnected from their emotions, often can be very clear thinkers, but really disconnected from everything else. Now there's the spiritualizing subtype who, for a variety of reasons, they never even made it that far. So they actually live in the energetic field. They're not in their bodies at all. And they've never had the experience of being in their bodies. Now, one of the things that we see that comes out of that dynamic is that many of these individuals are highly attuned to real spiritual states. And so, because for a variety of reasons that I actually go into detail with, if I had more time I'd do it here, about how that dynamic works. So But at the same time, it's a kind of a spiritual bypass in the sense that they've learned to do that to protect themselves, but they've never learned to really be a body on this planet. And so it isn't that whatever spiritual capacities or any kind of capacities that we develop growing up to help us survive, we don't have to give those up, but we have other options. That's really what I see NARM doing, is helping people. We're not there to take anything away. We're there to really help people have more options in their life, so that a person doesn't have to automatically stay in the energetic field outside their bodies, even though they may feel more connected to spiritual states and to nature and to other kinds of things. But we're holding at least the possibility for any individual that he or she or they can be embodied, be a body on this planet, be a body in relationship with other bodies, other human beings. And so in the brief time that I have, I think that's about as much as I can share. But thank you. Okay.
Corinne, are we good for one more question?
Yeah, if Larry's okay for one more question.
One more question is fine.
Great, thanks, Larry.
I'm going to unmute Maggie. Hi, Maggie. Can you hear? Can you speak?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So my question is, I love your book and all the nuance and just the comprehensiveness of it and all that. And I'm wondering, especially in this context when there's 200 people here and so many of the things that are disrupts our the organization of ourselves as a culture, and whether or not there are, for instance, the last question, I feel that's so individual. It's I couldn't even follow everything you were saying, and where it's wow, you really need an expert to kind of talk about that. But I feel, especially as clinicians, right? We're all doing our own work, and I'm just wondering if you or any of your graduates or more people are working with groups to make things more accessible in order to kind of address, like I said, the things that are having an impact on us as growing up in our culture. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense, and it's a question of understanding again, because we want to be able to address as many people as possible in this house. Now, one of the things this question is often asked to me by somebody in training, and one of my common responses is, we've been doing this we've been doing work in a group, and those consistently we get the feedback as let's get through the initial fear that people on themselves and the level of vulnerability. There's such a heart space that tends to open up in the group, and people there's a power through the group effect. Got it stable for a second. I can't hear you anymore.
So we're here, Larry. There you go. You're back. Your video had frozen for a moment. You're back.
Okay. So I was just saying that, that in the training groups we do it in group work. Now, we also have been training people in various kinds of treatment facilities, and they're applying the NARM principles in group settings as well. We take more time than we have available to go into the details of how we do that. But we're actually we're talking with one large treatment facility that they want to become a NARM-certified facility, because all of their people have been trained in NARM so far, and they really like it and find it useful. And they're doing it in groups. And I've had other people share similar kinds of dynamics or experiences at least that it can be done in groups. And there is something actually very powerful about group energy in doing work in groups. So I think that hopefully as best I can, I'm answering at least certainly it can be done in settings.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much. And I'm realizing a lot of thank yous coming in the comments. I realize we're over our time already, everybody. So we do need to end the session now and let Larry get on with the day. But Larry, I think